Hello guys, welcome back. My name is Nathan, and today I'm going to be ranking every single first overall pick of the past 30 seasons from worst to best. Now, we've seen some of the best first overall picks in NHL history over the past 30 years, players that ended up dominating for their teams and leading the entire NHL. On the other hand, though, we got some of the biggest busts in NHL history in the past 30 years that gave us some massive disappointment. But who do I see as the best and the worst first overall picks of the past 30 years, and where does every single first overall pick rank in today's video? Watch till the end for every single pick and the entire rankings, and hit that subscribe button if you are new. 60% of the people that are watching are not subscribed. If you like hockey, this channel is the place to be. Now, to get us started in today's first overall picks rankings from worst to best, we're going to start out with the worst and start out today at number 30. This player, in my opinion, is the worst first overall pick in NHL history. And to me, at number 30, for the worst first overall pick, I have Yakupov. Now, Nail Yakupov's a legend in every single way besides the actual play on the ice. Only played 6 NHL seasons, 4 of the Oilers, 1 with the Blues, and 1 with the Avalanche. Inconsistency was really the name of Nail Yakupov's game. Sometimes he'd have short bursts of talent, but just wasn't able to put it all together, and so far has been a much better KHL and Russian player rather than NHL player. And in my opinion, with all of the conditioning advancement we've had lately in the NHL, to be as bad as Nail Yakupov was is almost insulting the Oilers fans with the 2012 first overall pick. Now we're going to move on to the next pick here, though. Move on to number 29. This is the first overall pick that's pretty infamous. Of course, we're going to go on to the Czech first overall pick back in the 1999 NHL draft. First overall by the Thrashers in Patrik Stefan. Now, Patrik Stefan still had a lot of good potential, and I think when it comes to him, a lot of it was because of injuries and inconsistencies, concussions, and hip injuries really plagued Stefan's career. But at the same time, when he was healthy, he still wasn't all too good, and especially like Nail Yakupov, wasn't able to really stick in the NHL completely. But now we're going to move on to number 28, and still one of the worst first overall picks in NHL history. We're going to move on to a guy that is also super infamous, and at the time was looked at as one of the best prospects hockey had really seen up to that point. Stefan was looked at as an okay first overall pick, but coming in number 28, I have Alexandre Daigle. Now, Alexandre Daigle, of course, the first overall pick back in 1993 by the Ottawa Senators, was at least a decent player consistently, which is more than Stefan and Nail Yakupov can say. I mean, he had a pretty good season in like 1994 where he got 51 points in 82 games, and he had a couple of seasons like that where he had some solid production. Still not what you'd like nearly for a first overall pick, but at least he was more consistent than the other guys I mentioned. Still though, for a first overall pick, as hyped as he was, it was an absolute disappointment. Now, talking about disappointments, we're going to move on to number 27, the next first overall pick in today's rankings. This is a player that, in terms of potential, I think was absolutely robbed with injuries and the team he was on. We're going to move on next up to the first overall pick in the 2000 NHL draft by the New York Islanders in Rick DiPietro. Now, to me, Rick DiPietro was really robbed in terms of actual play because he was hyped way too early, way too much, obviously, but injuries and being on the New York Islanders in the early 2000s wasn't much help either. He had a couple of still pretty good seasons, most notably, in my opinion, he ended up getting a .919 save percentage in 2007 with 62 games played. Not bad numbers for a NHL goaltender, but still, for a first overall pick, not the franchise leader the Islanders were hoping for. But now we're going to go on to number 26, and this is the part of the rankings that we finally started getting to some decent NHL players. Next up at number 26, I have the 2006 first overall pick by the Blues in Erik Johnson. Now, Erik Johnson was looked at the time as one of the best upcoming defensemen in the entire NHL, and he hasn't really come of that. He's been a decent defenseman at times, a top 4 one even at moments in his career, but in terms of first overall pick, especially with Taves going 3 and Backstrom going 5 in the same draft, I think the Blues would have selected a little bit differently if they had the choice today, let's say. Now I'm going to go on to another different story, though. This is kind of the opposite of Erik Johnson. Still a defenseman. He went first overall back in 1995, and this is a player that, in terms of actual play when he was healthy, was pretty good. Next up, I have Brian Berard from the Ottawa Senators. Now, he didn't really play much for the Ottawa Senators, didn't play any games for them, but he played his rookie season with the New York Islanders, where he got the Calder Trophy, 48 points in 82 games played. A few years later, we get 47 points in 58 games with the Blackhawks as a defenseman. And when Berard was healthy and actually playing, he was a pretty great offensive D-man, but suffered an eye injury pretty early on in his career, but was able to come back and show some great resiliency. But now moving on to number 24, we're going to go to another polar opposite of Brian Berard. And next up, I have the first overall pick back in the 1996 NHL draft. And next up, I have Chris Phillips from the Ottawa Senators. Now, to me, Chris Phillips isn't a first overall pick quality player, but I think he goes pretty underrated in the first overall pick landscape. He was a great leader and a great defensive defenseman for a very long time for that Sens franchise and was a huge cornerstone for that entire team. To me, when it comes to Phillips, he might not be a first overall quality guy, but in terms of the intangibles and some really good play still, I think there could be worse first overall picks, as you could probably notice throughout this list. Now we're going to go on to number 23 next up. This is a player that's kind of been inconsistent and has fluctuated a lot in his career, but I still think in terms of good top 6 players, he's definitely up there. At number 23, I have Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, first overall pick from 2011 by the Edmonton Oilers, and he's still worked out pretty well. He's still a good player and obviously is a big part of that Oilers core. I just think for a first overall pick, especially the talent that he had, he's been a little bit disappointing so far. Even in these last few years, though he's been better, still not as much as he probably should have been. But next up, we're going to move on to the 22nd spot in the first overall pick rankings. This is a player that's kind of been interesting, has had some bad injury luck, but is still developing right now in the New Jersey Devils system. At number 22, I have the first overall pick from 2017, and next up, I have Nico Hischier. Now, I still think Nico Hischier will be a really solid player, and obviously better, just slightly better than Ryan Nugent-Hopkins, and I think he will be a big part of that Devils core for a very long time. I do think guys like Jack Hughes will probably overshine him eventually. Even though Nico Hischier is the captain, I don't think he's as flashy as other first round or first overall picks, which is the reason why other people might not have him as high as he probably should be, but I still like his potential, and again, this guy is still 22 years old, super young for a developing first overall center. Next up, though, we're going to move on to a first overall pick that I also think goes pretty underrated, just like Chris Phillips. At number 21, I'm going to go with Czech first overall pick in Roman Hamrlik. Now, the Hammer, I think, is a super underrated first overall pick, played with a bunch of different NHL teams, but wherever he went, he was always solid and always good on both ends. This is a guy that made some big hits, though, was a good leader, and provided big hits and big plays that teams needed to make. I think he's a solid first overall pick, and when it comes to defensemen, there's much worse options out there than what the Tampa Bay Lightning eventually got. But now I can officially say that we are inside the top 20, and this is where we start to get into some really, really good first overall picks. This next one might not have that potential, or at least hasn't played up to that level yet, but I do think has that potential to still be worth a first overall pick. Maybe in a redraft, I wouldn't take him number 1, but again, potential-wise, still has a lot of talent. Next up at number 20, I have the first overall pick from 2018 in Rasmus Dahlin. Now, there is still a question out there of what Dahlin would be right now if he wasn't on the Buffalo Sabres, and I think his rookie season was by far his best year, and it's obvious that Buffalo has just kind of weighed him down little by little throughout his career. I still think there is a lot of potential there, but again, in terms of the wide scheme of first overall picks, he's been rather disappointing thus far, especially these past couple of seasons. Now coming in at number 19, you know what, we're going to go to another first overall pick defensively from the Buffalo Sabres, going on to the 2021 first overall pick, and next up at number 19, I have Owen Power. Now, I do think Owen Power will be slightly better than Rasmus Dahlin, just for the pure fact that Power is going back to the University of Michigan. He's not going to be on the Buffalo Sabres for his rookie season, or at least right after his draft year, which I think is definitely important. But Owen Power will get some more seasoning. I think that's a big reason why. And I think at number 19, this is a perfectly acceptable spot for a guy who will be a big part of that franchise going forward. But now going on to number 18, this is a player that might have been the hardest player to rank in today's video. I'm going to be honest with you guys. If we're talking about just the best seasons, this guy could be a lot higher, but unfortunately has had some bad inconsistencies. Next up, though, at number 18, I have the first overall pick from 2010 in Taylor Hall. Now, to me, Taylor Hall is an interesting one. Obviously, we're just counting that for that MVP season. He'd be a lot higher. But again, since that MVP season, he's been rather poor compared to expectations. He's been really good with the Boston Bruins, and it seems like a great fit there, so I'm really hoping that's able to continue. Now we're going to move on to number 17 and move on to a first overall pick that was pretty much just drafted a couple of seasons ago, has made some good progress since then in Jack Hughes. Now, to me, when it comes to Jack Hughes specifically, I think this last year was vastly important for his development, and he showed a lot of great strengths. On a bad Devils team, he showed a lot of great play, driving a lot of good consistency, which for a player that young, I think is definitely important. This next year, I think we could see him officially break out big time and be the main part and the big piece of that Devils rebuild. Next up, we're starting to get into the average of first overall picks in the rankings, and we're going to go on to number 16 and move on to another underrated first overall pick, in my opinion, a guy that does not get enough credit. If he wasn't injured this past year, I think we'd be all talking about him as a top 20 defenseman in this league. I got from the Florida Panthers the 2014 first overall pick in Aaron Ekblad. Now, I gotta say, I think Aaron Ekblad and Jack Hughes are pretty much completely similar in terms of the placement in this ranking. They could be honestly tied. I have Aaron Ekblad just above, just because I think the longevity could be even better with Ekblad. Unfortunately, the injury came this last year, and that was bad timing. But up to this point, Aaron Ekblad's been a great number one defenseman, especially these past couple of years. The first couple of seasons for him weren't fantastic, but since then, he's vastly improved on his play. Now we're going to move on to the number 15 spot, right smack dab in the middle. A first overall pick that is also super underrated. We're going to move on to the first overall pick by the Columbus Blue Jackets and move on to Rick Nash. Now, Rick Nash, to me, does not get enough credit for just simply how good he was in his prime and even how good he was later for the New York Rangers. This is a guy that I think was held back a lot being on the Columbus Blue Jackets and being a part of that franchise, especially offensively. But I think this is a guy that does not get enough credit for just how good he was and the longevity as well throughout his entire career. But now we are moving on to number 14, and this is a player that I think is actually pretty similar in terms of the play we'll see to Rick Nash. A first overall pick that was just drafted, didn't have the greatest rookie season, but I think he'll eventually be okay for the New York Rangers. We're going to move on to number 14 and move on to Alexis Lafreniere. Now, Alexis Lafreniere, I think this next season is going to break out in a big way. I think he's going to be great for the New York Rangers, and it's just a matter of time before he gets fully comfortable into a top line position. To me, all the opportunities there for Alexis Lafreniere. I think he was just a little bit overwhelmed and, quite frankly, simplified his game too much in his rookie year. I think that will change in year two, and I think it's just a matter of time before the busts, or at least the people that call him a bust, start being a little bit more quiet. Now we're going to move on to number 13. Go on to a player that I think also, in terms of play, goes a little bit underrated too. I'm going to move on to the first overall pick by the Tampa Bay Lightning in Vinny Lecavalier. Now, Vinny Lecavalier, to me, is an extremely underrated player for his entire career. I mean, this is a guy that from day one was great and continued to be a great player. Won the Maurice Richard Trophy, won a Stanley Cup, and was such a big part of the Tampa Bay Lightning, and even the Philadelphia Flyers later in his career. Just such a great overall player and a big reason why the Lightning was such a great team during the 2000s. Now we're going to move on to the next pick here, though, at number 12. This, to me, is where we start to get into the really, really solid first overall picks and really, really good first overall picks, which for first overall picks means they're great players. At number 12, though, I'm going to go with the first overall pick by the New York Islanders from 2009 in John Tavares. Now, to me, John Tavares isn't quite in that top 10 elite of the elite category, but I think John Tavares, his best seasons were still great offensively, and he's one of the best offensive players over the past decade, in my opinion. Still not that elite or generational player, but I do think when it comes to Tavares, he's still one of the best out there, and is still a very solid player to this day. But now we're going to get just outside the top 10 at number 11, and this might be my most controversial placement of the list, but again, I'm looking at the entire careers of these guys, and even for the younger guys, I'm looking at what they'll probably be in the future when their whole career is said and done. This is a player that I think, in terms of his best years, was among the best goalies in the league, but I do think his worst years were quite a bit underratedly bad. We're going to move on to number 11 and move on to future Hall of Famer Marc-Andre Fleury. Now, I want to say this right now, again, his best years were sensational, and right now he is one of the best goalies in the entire league, but I do think people kind of forget just how rough he was in the early 2010s for the Penguins, and just how bad he was simply put in clutch situations in the playoffs. Still a great goaltender, and still a Hall of Famer, just not in my top 10 personally. Now we're going to move on inside that top 10, though, and go on to a criminally underrated first overall pick, a pick that I think people kind of forget was as good as he was in his prime, mostly because he played some seasons in the KHL, but at number 10, I'm going to go with the first overall pick by the Atlanta Thrashers and move on to Ilya Kovalchuk. To me, Ilya Kovalchuk's prime is just simply sensational. This was a guy that was among the top leaders in points throughout his prime years on the Atlanta Thrashers. Really didn't have too much to work with, and I feel like was bringing the most and bringing all the heart and soul for a team that really didn't have much on its stakes. He barely made the playoffs because he was on the Thrashers, and just everything combined together just created a situation where he wasn't able to win the Stanley Cup and wasn't able to get too much success in the playoffs, sadly. But again, in terms of peaks, in terms of pure talent level, Kovalchuk is among the best out there. But now moving on to number 9, another guy that was robbed of a much better career. I'm going to go to the first overall pick, and the oldest first overall pick on this list, going all the way back to 1991, and technically the Quebec Nordiques / the Philadelphia Flyers. Next up, I have Eric Lindros. Eric Lindros was a player that, in terms of, again, we're talking about just pure peaks here, and even career-wise, whenever he was playing, he was a dominant, great overall player. And it's really sad to see the concussions playing his career as much as it did, because I think we were robbed from a truly elite and almost generational career in terms of talent. And again, when he was playing, he was brilliant, and I also compensate a little bit for maybe some of those games that he lost, and I'm kind of assuming that those maybe were played in his career, because again, I think we have to assume that if he was playing a lot more games, he'd be a lot more highly regarded. Still an amazing first overall pick, though, when he was playing for Philadelphia. Now we're going to go on to number 8. This was another player that was plagued from an even better career. Still, in the end, though, had a pretty decent one. I'm going to move on to the first overall pick by the Tampa Bay Lightning back in 2008 and move on to Steven Stamkos. Now, Steven Stamkos winning these back-to-back Stanley Cups is just fantastic. For a guy that's had terrible luck throughout his career, obviously he had the fantastic seasons. I mean, 60 goals is just as classic as it is. But when it comes to Stamkos, there was always a doubt that he would be able to win a Stanley Cup or even have a fully healthy career. And even though the injuries have plagued him quite a bit, being able to win those 2 Stanley Cups, and again, when he was playing, still a fantastic player, definitely raised his stakes, in my opinion, and his stock on this list. But this is where the list starts to get really competitive. Coming in at number 7, I'm going to go from the first overall pick in 2016 in the Toronto Maple Leafs first overall pick with Auston Matthews. Auston Matthews, to me at least, is still one of the best first overall picks, especially over the past decade. Obviously, regular season-wise is where most of the production comes. Playoff-wise, it's not too great. But in terms of the regular season, he is one of the best offensive players in the league and is one of the best goal scorers we've seen over this last decade. And honestly, I don't see that really stopping. At least regular season wise, I see Matthews continuing to kill it. And hey, if he goes off the Leafs, maybe he'll be able to win a Stanley Cup. We'll see. Next up, I'm going to move on to number 6, going away from that. And again, this is where this list just starts to get so competitive. There's just so little wiggle room throughout all these different picks. But at number 6, I'm going to go with another guy that has yet to win the Stanley Cup, unfortunately. But I think he often goes underlooked because of that. We're going to go on to number 6 and go on to Jumbo Joe Thornton. To me, Thornton, just like Kovalchuk a little bit, his prime is often underlooked just how good it truly was. This guy got 92 assists in his best year, and to me, that's like, nowadays, even though scoring is still up, it's almost hard to even compute that is even possible. But Joe Thornton was that good and that just consistent offensively. One of the best playmakers the NHL has truly ever seen. But folks, this is where it starts to get serious. We are now inside the top 5 first overall picks over the last 30 years. And you know what? To start us off with an absolute bang, let's go on to number 5 and the first overall pick in 2013 from the Colorado Avalanche in Nathan MacKinnon. Now, Nathan MacKinnon is the second best player in the league in my opinion. And in terms of the last 10 years, in terms of talent, in terms of skating, he is one of the best out there. And if it wasn't for Connor McDavid, Nathan MacKinnon would be the face of the NHL right now. Hasn't quite had the playoff success, sadly, yet, but I do think that will eventually come in his short so far NHL career. Now we're going to move on to number 4, and this is a placement that I think could also go a lot of different ways. Again, it's so tight, especially in this top 5, top 10 range. But at number 4, I'm going to go with a guy that has had the playoff success and has really achieved all of the hype that he once had. We're going to go on to the first overall pick from the 2007 NHL draft from the Chicago Blackhawks in Patrik Kane. Now, I still have his gripes with his defense nowadays, but in terms of offense, he's still one of the best players, I think, really in NHL history. One of the best American players, of course, as well in NHL history. And again, in terms of talent, in terms of production, has done about as much as you could possibly ever hoped. For a first overall pick, American-wise, definitely making Mike Modano pretty proud. But now we're inside the top 3, and again, it's even more serious here, and there's a lot of different ways that I could go here as well. But at number 3, I will end up going with Alex Ovechkin, first overall pick in the 2004 NHL draft. Alex Ovechkin is, simply put, the best goal scorer in NHL history. I don't really have to say much more than that. Obviously, the Stanley Cup win puts him a little bit higher in my regard, but I've always loved Alex Ovechkin as a player, as a personality, and getting that Stanley Cup is definitely great, but he's the best goal scorer of all time, and that's really all that needs to be said. Now I'm going to go on to the top 2, and again, we were getting into the serious parts, but at number 2, at number 1, these 2 players, you'll probably know who they are, but these 2 players are interchangeable for me. I have one player higher for a specific reason. I will get into that. But at number 2, for the second best first overall pick over the last 30 years, I have Connor McDavid. Now, to me, Connor McDavid is really just lacking one thing, and it's not because, obviously because of the team he's on, it's a lot lesser than the number 1 pick could achieve, but the playoff success hasn't really been there, and even individually, he hasn't been as good playoff-wise as one would have hoped, but Connor McDavid is the best player in the league right now. In my opinion, might be the best offensive player in terms of skating, in terms of talent that we've seen pretty much since Wayne Gretzky or Mario Lemieux. He's just that good, and the defense has also taken a pretty big improvement. He'll eventually win the Stanley Cup for the Edmonton Oilers, I hope, and I hope Connor McDavid gets rewarded for just how good he truly is. But without further ado, let's get into number 1, the best first overall pick over the past 30 seasons. And at number 1, I have to go with Sidney Crosby. Sidney Crosby and Connor McDavid, again, are interchangeable in my opinion, but Crosby having those cup wins and having that playoff success, I think, puts it just over the edge for me. I think Connor McDavid might be more talented, just barely, and might have more potential as a player, but to me, Sidney Crosby has just achieved too much to not have number 1. The gold medals, the Stanley Cups, the success and the consistency. He is still one of the best players in the entire league right now, and still continues to prove just how good he truly is. But that'll be it for today, guys. Thank you so much for watching. If you did enjoy, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and hit that notification bell. Let me know in the comments down below, what did you agree and disagree with my first overall pick rankings? What would you change, and what would your rankings look like? Make sure you share share this video with all your friends, get it to any hockey fans you might know, and click on this card for all my hockey rankings content right in one playlist. My name is Nathan. Thank you so much for watching. Have a great day, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye.